Okay, welcome to the December 2017 Green Infrastructure, Climate and City Seminar Series. This is the last of our 2017 series. I'm happy to announce we're going to be continuing into 2018. We'll have, again, first Wednesday of every month, 4 o'clock in this room, we'll have a series of speakers. I'll show that in a moment. I want to start with a little announcement. Drexel, in addition to being part of the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast that sponsors this series with a bunch of partners, is also now the seat of the North American hub of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. And it's been about a year since this hub, which is not just an academic, it's supposed to be an engagement between stakeholders, city managers, and researchers. So if you're interested, on January 10th at 12 p.m. in Nesbitt Hall, 3215 Market Street, we'll be showing you where we've come and talking a little bit about different ways of getting engaged, whether you're at the university or in practice. So come join us there. I just wanted to make that quick announcement. Also, this is the second announcement. So we've now put together our agenda for 2018, and you can see the topics here slightly different. We've tried to vary the topics from the 2017 and also from the previous year. So we'll have a variety of different speakers. We can't confirm the speakers yet because many of the invitations are still there, but I just wanted to make the point that whether you're attending in person or online, we will continue the momentum, and please do join us for the next one, which is January 3rd, focusing on the municipal response. So what are cities doing to respond to climate change? So again, for those of you who are new, we have 1 to 3 speakers per month, and we usually try to make this interactive. And so there's folks joining online and there's folks here in the room. We're happy to take your questions now. If you're attending live, we also archive these talks, and you can download any of the past 24 sessions of this series on the CCRUN website. So today our focus is decarbonization, and we have Dr. Carl Hausker, who is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute Climate Program, where he focuses on modeling climate mitigation, decarbonization, social cost of carbon, and the new climate economy. Previously, Dr. Hausker was President Clinton's Deputy Assistant Administrator in the EPA office, policy office, where he was working on interagency climate policy and was involved in some of the early Conference on the Parties work. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Hausker to come up, and he'll give us, I guess, a 2-part presentation with some opportunity for discussion halfway through.
Okay. Thanks very much for this opportunity to be at Drexel today, and also to talk with people online, for those of you online. The full title of my talk is A Deeper Look at Deep Decarbonization Pathways for the U.S. If your focus has often been very urban, we're going to kind of zoom out to the national level in my talk today. Let me give you sort of an outline of where we're going to go. We're going to do a little bit of background. Going to talk about the 2 camps on deep decarbonization, and take a look at some studies, and then talk a little bit about the policy implications. Disclaimer, I'm speaking only for myself. World Resources Institute is 800 people, and we have, of course, diverse views across that large number of people. I'm going to be moving very fast through some material. I have lots of links in my PowerPoint, and I'm happy to email it to anyone who requests it. But let's start with the imperative for deep decarbonization. If you don't think that climate change is an existential crisis for civilization, then you're probably in the wrong room, or you got the wrong link online, and what I'm going to say makes absolutely no sense. But if you do, then you know that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% or more by mid-century, and that's a big challenge, a doable challenge. but it is a steep path. Today I'm just going to focus on energy and CO2 emissions from energy. As I'm sure everyone knows, we actually have 6 greenhouse gases to tackle, as well as land use changes that affect the amount of CO2 sequestered in soil and forests. What I'm going to describe to you, and as many of you probably already know through your work, I'm going to describe 2 camps in how we reduce carbon from the energy sector by 80% or more. There is a camp that says we need to sort of use all the above. We need renewables. We're going to have to use some nuclear power. We're going to have to commercialize carbon capture technologies and apply them either to fossil fuel plants and or bioenergy plants and or industrial sources for which we don't have alternatives. That's one camp that I call all of the above. There is another camp that says we can do this all with 100% renewables and with various ways to integrate those together to fuel an industrial economy. There are very smart and impassioned people in both of those camps. I'll make it plain, I am in the camp of all of the above. We're going to look at 2 studies that represent that body of literature and studies, and then we're going to take a deep dive at a prominent study that says we can do this all with renewables. This is particularly for students. You're going to be wrestling with this for several decades. For people like me a little older, we may not see the end of this debate, but it's very important to look under the hood of these modeling studies and understand really what's going on. Why does one camp say we need a portfolio of zero carbon technologies to lick this problem, while another camp says we can do it all with renewables? So we're going to take a look at snapshots of 2 studies and look at the implementation problems there. We're going to do a deep dive on the work of Mark Jacobson out at Stanford, who has been a prominent advocate of 100% renewables, and then move to some policy implications. I'm going to stop halfway through and take some questions before turning to Jacobson's work, just because we have a setting that I think allows that. So I'm going to talk about 2 studies, where I say that have a long shelf life. One I led at World Resources Institute. It's called From Risk to Return, Investing in a Clean Energy Economy. That came out in December 2016. The other, taking a similar approach in many ways, is the Obama administration's mid-century strategy report for deep decarbonization. This came out in November 2016, just after the election. Strangely, it's not on the White House website anymore, but fortunately archived at the UNFCCC. And both of these studies, I think, are important. They have a long shelf life, frankly, because the federal government isn't going to do anything like the MCS study for quite a while, unfortunately. Both of these studies looked out to 2050. They looked at an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases, 80% across all 6 gases for the MCS report, Mid-Century Strategy Report. The Risky Business Report just looked at the energy sector. So if we look at the energy sector, across these 2 studies and the whole body of modeling and deep decarbonization, there are really 3 things we need to do. The first pillar is that we need to switch as many end uses from the direct combustion of fossil fuels to the direct use of electricity, or to a clean fuel derived from electricity, like hydrogen or synthetic gas. So you really have to electrify the economy to the greatest extent possible. What does that mean? Transportation, obviously, electric vehicles. In buildings, it's stop burning gas and fuel oil and using electricity for all your space conditioning, of course, air conditioning, and hot water heating. In industry, it's trying to switch as many industrial applications from the combustion of fossil fuels and heat generated to, again, direct use of electricity, or perhaps burning hydrogen for various industrial uses. That's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2, of course, if you're going to generate all that electricity, you have to squeeze the carbon out of it. And fortunately, we have many options to do that. We have nuclear power. We have a whole variety of renewable energy sources with zero emissions, and we also have carbon capture technology that can be put on fossil fuel generation or bioenergy generation, and you can squeeze out at least 90%, maybe more of the emissions, capturing them and injecting them into stable geologic formations. The third pillar, of course, is we need to be as energy efficient as possible across the entire economy, all sectors, to bring the total energy demand down to a level which we can then generate with these zero or low carbon sources. There's some metrics at the bottom of this graph that you can dig into if you wish. This is from the Risky Business study. But again, these three pillars are common across all the deep decarbonization literature. To show what that may mean for energy use, this figure shows current fossil fuel energy in quads and where we could get to in 2050 under one of the pathways modeled in Risky Business, and what happens to non-fossil fuel energy. And finally, we have a little bit of hydrogen production in this particular scenario. The gray bar represents coal use, of course, almost entirely used for power generation. In this pathway, we can squeeze that down to a very small amount. This bar, the brown bar, is petroleum use. That can also be reduced dramatically through the electrification of light-duty vehicles and through some substitution of biofuels, more than what we're doing now with ethanol. And that can be squeezed down to largely residual use in aviation and heavy-duty transport. Interestingly, natural gas, the kind of yellowish bar, is a transition fuel and can still play a big role in 2050 if you're burning it to produce power and capturing the emissions, or if you're using it in some industrial sources, again, capturing emissions. You can see that on the non-fossil fuel area, we have a red slab of nuclear power that can remain stable or grow. You have biofuels largely right now in the form of ethanol, which is not a particularly environmentally friendly fuel in many ways. But if you are optimistic about the total biomass potential in the U.S., you can switch over to cellulosic ethanol and biodiesel and biogas, and that can play a significant role in the years ahead. And you can also, of course, grow your solar and your wind, your blue and orange bars, which look small in this primary energy measure, but you'll see they play a huge role in the power sector, as we'll see in a moment. So in this projection, we used a model called Pathways. The MCS study used the GCAM model. Both of these may be familiar to you. Both of them have a population that grows, an economy that grows. So in the baseline projections, you have, of course, total energy and CO2 growing. But if we do the things we know how to do with commercial technologies, near commercial technologies, and apply those three pillars, we can actually have less primary energy consumption in 2050, but still supply the end-use services that we need. So let's take a look at what the power generation sector looks like in 2050 across four pathways that we modeled. Here we have like a reference business as usual scenario, still dominated by fossil generation without carbon capture, a little bit of nuclear, a little bit of renewables. And across, we looked at four scenarios. I'm just going to start on the right-hand side. We looked at one where we had a relatively high role for CCS, mostly on gas plants, but some coal. We had a relatively high nuclear scenario, relatively high renewables, and then kind of the most balanced blend of those three zero or low carbon power sources. You can see, first of all, that compared to the reference case, all of these pathways require more electricity generation, measured by billion kilowatt hours on the left-hand axis. But each of them has a strong surge in renewables, because of course the price of renewables has been dropping dramatically over the last 10 years, but they retain some baseload in the form of nuclear or fossil with CCS. And this little gray slab is, yeah, it's always good to have a few gas turbines to balance load. So that's how we get to a very electrified economy, yet with dramatically lower CO2 emissions coming out of the power sector. I'll just stop there for a second. Any questions on what I've described so far in the power sector and the three pillars? Yes.
Regarding the third pillar, energy efficiency, do the metrics or standards for efficiency change once electricity itself becomes decarbonized? Like, for instance, would absolute energy consumption take a backseat to the proportion of energy usage that's wasted or inefficient?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it takes a backseat. Our metric here was megajoules of energy per dollar of GDP, and so we don't have carbon directly factored into that. In the risky business study, we felt that we could shrink megajoules per dollar of GDP by almost 2/3. Part of that is the use of electricity is inherently more efficient than combustion of fossil fuels, so that drives part of it. But we're also, over the next 30 years in this model, applying a whole vast array of technological fixes to buildings, vehicles, and industry to reduce energy use as well. So it's a combination of both sort of pure efficiency plus the conversion from fossil fuels to electricity. Let me give you a flavor. Yes?
Just on that chart where you were showing the electricity generation, you mentioned early on you were assuming that there would be a transition from fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So is this electricity associated with, in other words, those increases, are they largely associated with a transition of, from gasoline and diesel to electric vehicles?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a piece of the pie not shown, which are the vehicles that continue to be powered by fossil fuels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is power generation only, and the increase, I don't have the breakdown at the tip of my tongue, but I think the electrification of the vehicle fleet is probably the single biggest driver of the increased electricity generation over baseline. But there is also in these numbers the electrification of buildings and electrification of some industry sources. So I don't have that breakdown tip of my tongue, but I think the vehicles are a key driver of that. Yes?
In those bar graphs there, you said these also, though, each one of these represents a scenario where we've achieved significant carbon reduction overall. So what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, each of our pathways meets an 80% goal, 80% reduction from 2005 levels. And I ought to also put a footnote.
By 2050?
By 2050. But I also want to put a footnote on that, which is, for those of you who follow the science, again, 80% is probably the minimum we should achieve by 2050. We may need to go deeper. So at one level, this is the least we have to do, but I also want to be optimistic in the sense of this only assumes commercial technologies currently or near commercial. Technology is going to bring us pleasant surprises over the next 30 years, mostly pleasant surprises on this front. So I think those, you can look at the glass half empty or half full on that front. Let me describe a little bit the mid-century strategy report that the Obama administration filed, and this was done, interestingly, collectively with Mexico and Canada in late November of 2016. As some of you may know, under the Paris Agreement, nations not only set near-term reduction targets in the 2025-2030 range, but nations were encouraged to also do studies of how they can get to much deeper reductions. And this is what the Obama administration put out. I'm sorry, this is their graphic with tiny font, but on the left we have gigatons of emissions, CO2 equivalent. We have 2005, some base case growth without mitigation, and now we see what can we do in the energy sector, CO2 sequestration, and reduction of the non-CO2 gases. And what you find here in this study is the same three pillars in the energy sector. First, an electrification of the economy and production of low-carbon fuels. That's pillar number one. Pillar number two is the decarbonization of the power supply through expansion of renewables, expansion of fossil fuel with CCS, and some expansion of nuclear power. And then finally, the third pillar, gains in efficiency across transportation, buildings, and industry. So again, similar magnitudes, all those strategies have to play a role, and the Obama administration GCAM modeling also had a role for, again, for renewables, carbon capture, and nuclear. Then they have some additional reductions on a net basis, enhanced carbon sequestration, and then some additional strategies for the non-CO2 gases. So that's what that looked like. And just to touch base on others, kind of what I'll call, all of the above type modeling, even the Natural Resource Defense Council did modeling that was released just about 2 months ago. It's called America's Clean Energy Frontier. And again, this looks out to 2050. It also used the Pathways model as the Risky Business Report did. But as we go from current electricity consumption out to where we could be in 2050, yes, it has a huge expansion of renewables. The color isn't quite right, but that's wind, actually. That big bar, a big expansion of solar. They maintain hydro generation, but they still have some nuclear plants operating. In 2050, they have some fossil with CCS, and they have some uncontrolled natural gas. Again, trying to make sure that the lights stay on and load is balanced. If we just jump to the global level for a moment, and again, I know I'm going fast. The links are here if you want to do a deep dive at any of these studies. The International Energy Agency has over the years modeled what's possible at the global level. And last year they put out their energy technology perspectives that showed where the gigatons globally would be under a 4-degree scenario if we sort of do what we've sort of promised we're going to do so far. But how do we need to go further to take that down to gigatons globally that are consistent with a 2-degree warming scenario? And again, they sort of say all of the above. Expand renewables like crazy, become much more energy efficient, but switch out of fossil fuels into biofuels, expand nuclear, and develop carbon capture technologies of some of the fossil. So this is what I call kind of the larger body of mainstream modeling that says we need all the tools. This pathway has its implementation challenges. First of all, of course, there's a lot of opposition to the expansion of nuclear power in various countries today. It also tends to be very expensive, especially in the U.S. and Europe, trying to build a plant. Other places, they seem to be able to bring plants online at a more reasonable cost. Carbon capture is still not fully commercialized. We've done some promising pilots. It's still pretty expensive. And there may be public opposition, the first time we try to really build plants on a larger scale. Renewables, of course, they face their own siting problems. If you like hawks, you don't like what windmills do to hawks. If you like tortoises, you don't like vast solar arrays in the desert sometimes. So each of these has political opposition. But turning to more technical implementation challenges, just the pure rate of power plant construction over the next 30 years is kind of daunting. 2 to 4 times historical rates of construction if we're going to electrify the economy. That expansion also has to be accompanied by an expansion of the transmission and distribution systems. And as many of you probably know, just building any transmission line in the U.S. right now faces very stark NIMBY problems. The electrical vehicle infrastructure that would take to electrify the fleet faces some interesting challenges. Are we charging vehicles at the workplace, at home, both places? Do we have fast charging technology, slow charging? Do we do battery swapping? We're not sure yet, and we're not sure how to sort of integrate the transport sector and the power sector in a way they've never had to work together before. But that's also an interesting implementation challenge, along with the kind of discussions that are already underway about changing utility business models, changing power market design in the wholesale markets in a way that will enable this rapid expansion of the power sector. There's also something about what's going to happen to fossil fuel prices, which I won't go into, which is kind of an interesting challenge as well. But just to give you an idea of the kind of capacity build-out we would need to electrify the economy, I pulled out this graph from the Mid-Century Strategy Report, which over here shows the historical additions of gigawatts per year from 2000 to 2016. Here's the big build-out of gas plants that happened that also led to a number of bankruptcies when they couldn't sell their power. And then here we have sort of more stable areas of the last 10 years with gas continuing to build out, additions of solar and wind coming in a big way. Unfortunately, in kind of a start-stop way with what's happened to the PTC and the ITC. But, we're over 30 gigawatts a year recently. Well, that needs to increase over the next 20 years under the Mid-Century Strategy Report scenario, and then to over 40 gigawatts per year. And then in the remainder of this first half century, we need to go over 70 gigawatts a year as you really accelerate the electrification of the economy. Is this impossible? No. But you have to line up the policy, you have to line up the financial sector, you have to line up a lot of things to enable that rapid expansion. So let me stop there. I'm going to switch to the 100% renewables, but again, invite any other questions and any online questions on the first part of this presentation. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts on what can be done to further this sort of decision-making? I mean, I'm sort of assuming that if we had a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system, that would incentivize all of this. And there's a lot of talk now about how, what localities and subnational actors can do. Do you see a role for subnational actors in the absence of a carbon tax, in the absence of a national policy that could possibly affect this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm a little depressed about the role of federal policy over the next couple of years, and my talk so far has been kind of policy free. As with the discussion on the 100% renewables, we're looking more at kind of the technical feasibility. We can also talk about cost a little bit, but of course none of this is going to happen without policy. And so the bad news is, looks like we are totally going the wrong direction at the federal level. But the good news is that there's been an incredible surge of support at the state level, local level, business level, and I think the U.S. can keep some momentum going over the next couple of years. Not the full momentum that we need, but hopefully wiser heads will recognize that we need strong federal policy. At a minimum, we will probably need, well, not at a minimum, but a foundational driver is a carbon tax. I don't think it's sufficient. Some economists may differ, but in my view, a combination of a carbon tax as kind of a foundational signal, along with a series of well-designed incentives and regulations, some at the federal level, some at the state level, some at the local level, need to combine to create the scale of change and the direction that we need. For instance, smart growth and transit-oriented development are an important part of becoming a more energy-sufficient society. There are not many federal or state levers that can affect that very well. They can create a supportive environment, but a lot of those decisions are at the MPO level, city level, county level. But we can come back to a policy discussion at the end. I don't want to go down that road too far right now. Yes?
Thanks. I think this is really interesting, the electric capacity additions that are required. I guess this is national, and I'm wondering if you could speak to which of the segments of the electricity grid would need more or less in these projections. So how do these match up with our current distribution strategies for electricity? Mm-hmm. And where would these additions be most?
Yeah, the question is that these are national aggregate numbers. Where how does this break down by segment? But I just need to clarify, when you say how does it break down, are you talking about by geographic region or by type of power plant, or?
I was thinking by geographic region, with the east and west and Texas are split and
Mm-hmm.
they'll distribute across those. So how do we get the amount of solar and wind
Right.
And we have those geographic
Mhm.
splits in terms of where we could send energy
Mhm.
from states.
Yeah, I may have a slide in the appendix that actually gives the breakdown by 9 census regions, because the pathways model and perhaps the GCAM model too gives that kind of regional breakdown. And the careful modeling efforts do look at where do we have resources. We have abundant wind potential in the Midwest. We have abundant wind potential offshore Atlantic. We have, of course, greater solar potentials Southwest, et cetera. So when you look at the regional breakdowns in the risky business study, you will see the sort of the blossoming decade by decade of wind in the Midwest, solar in the Southwest. You'll see some nuclear plants being built in the Southeast U.S. because we assume that the regulatory environment will remain more friendly than in some other parts of the country. There's also a geographically driven build out of the transmission system, including some better connection, the Eastern Interconnect and the Western Interconnect, to allow power to move. All that's done in a very granular way and in a way that balances load. So and it also assumes some role for rooftop solar, but most of it is built as utility scale solar because it's a lot cheaper. So that's all that granularity. If you want to do a deep dive, it's all there for you. Yes?
With respect to energy efficiency, how far down did you go in breaking out uses, for instance, domestic uses of electricity?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I have a 2,700 square foot townhouse in Center City, Philadelphia. We're very energy efficient with respect to our commuting, and recently I converted every single bit of lighting in the house to LED, and my electricity bills now are half of what they were before.
Mm-hmm.
Did you go down that fine a grain in your uses of
Mm-hmm.
the electricity?
Yeah. In the risky business study, the pathways model is built on the NEMS framework, the National Energy Modeling System, and so it has a lot of detail on end uses. It builds up total energy demand by literally looking at lighting in homes, lighting in commercial, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, again, a lot of detail there on evolution of lighting from 2015 out to 2050, building shells. But interestingly, and I think partly relevant to your question, the model doesn't accelerate stock turnover. It basically says when your townhouse is torn down, after 100 years, whatever life is, then we'll put up a more efficient building. But in the meantime, we'll simply do shell improvements on the existing housing stock or commercial building stock. Similar with power plants or vehicles. We don't just convert all to electric vehicles in 2022. We naturally let vehicles get to the end of their life and then assume that we have policy drivers that bring in a new technology or better technology. Yeah.
Back to transport. So you mentioned smart growth earlier, and you also talked about a transition to electric vehicles. Of course, if you do smart growth, you could reduce vehicle use and not need as much of a transition. So I'm curious, in these scenarios you're showing, how radical a change in development patterns are we thinking, or none? I mean, are we assuming that people will live in the suburbs and commute with vehicles and that they'll just be electric vehicles, or are there implicit some assumptions about densification as we're seeing, for example, in parts of New Jersey?
Yeah. The two studies that I cite here took different approaches, and other studies will be somewhere on that spectrum. In the Risky Business Report, we decided to be conservative, and we assumed that there wouldn't be any big surge in smart growth. So you still have, in 2050, in our model, people driving about 12,000 miles per year per capita. And so that makes the challenge harder to meet, but we found a way to meet it. The Mid-Century Strategy Report also held VMT constant for a couple of pathways, but then they had a smart growth scenario with significant decreased demand for transportation services. It became easier to meet. My kind of off the top of my head response is, given that we probably need to cut more than 80% to solve this problem, we probably need both. We probably need more efficient cities, denser development. But again, of course, there's a whole bunch of political obstacles to that. But it's, and it's also almost a intergenerational thing. There are signs that, you know, people in their 20s and 30s don't want to live in the suburbs the way that my generation does. And so is that trend going to continue or not? We'll see. Lots of unknowns. In the interest of time, I should move on to 100% renewables. And again, I want to caution that that there are very smart and impassioned people on both camps. I happen to personally believe I'm in the all the above camp, and I'm going to talk about the 100% renewable camp and some of the criticisms that have been leveled at this work. Mark Jacobson and some co-authors first put out a scenario for the U.S. of 100% wind, water, solar, all renewables in 2015. They have followed that with publications that have provided sort of similar roadmaps or pathways for each of the 50 states and also for 139 countries. So they have a model, they have an approach that they feel works sort of across the board. There have been a number of people who care about climate who have really embraced this idea of 100% renewables. You have Hawaii setting a law that says 100% renewable by 2045, legislation in California, Oregon, Washington, other states. 4 senators introduced 100% renewable by 2050 Act. You have cities, over 100 cities, I think, that have said we're going to go 100% clean energy, and I think they mean, you know, renewables. Over 100 companies embracing this. And Jacobson's work has put him on the cover of Scientific American and TED Talks, and it's really become kind of a base for saying this is how we should go. And it's also reinforced by the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the cost of solar and wind has dropped dramatically over the last 10 years, and also we're developing batteries, prices have come down. So what's not to like about this? It's very significant for those of you who want to stay close in this field. There was a very significant event in June of 2017. Just as Jacobson published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 20 leading climate and energy modelers published a quite withering critique of Jacobson's work in June. And as far as academic language, it doesn't get much more brutal than this. Invalid tools, modeling errors, implausible and inadequately supported assumptions. Policymakers, please treat with caution. Those are fighting words in academia. And interestingly, in, I believe, September, but later in the summer or early fall, Professor Jacobson filed a $10 million lawsuit against the NAS for publishing this, and he also filed a companion lawsuit against the lead author of this. My personal view, this is not how to solve disputes over analysis and modeling, and actually, it's quite disturbing in my personal view. But I think we need to take a really hard look at the 100% renewable scenarios. It's a smaller body of literature. There are a couple other authors, both for the U.S. and globally, who do this. Smaller body of work, but it has a very large following, and we need to look under the hood. So before we do that deep dive, just to make sure we all have kind of grasp of the magnitudes we're talking about, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. A large central power plant is often the size of about 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt. A terawatt is 1,000 gigawatts. Right now, our total U.S. electric capacity is about 1 terawatt. Think of 1,000 central station power plants. Produces the power we use right now. Of course, it's not 1,000, it's actually a mixture of some really big ones, medium-sized and small-sized ones. But we currently have a capacity of about 1 terawatt. Jacobson's study assumes, like all studies in this area, sort of the 3 pillars. First, we're going to increase energy efficiency dramatically. We're going to electrify end uses, but then, and we're going to literally go to 0 fossil fuel use by 2050, And also, he does not envision a role for bioenergy either. No harvesting of crop residues or growing of crops dedicated to producing biofuels. The third pillar is to produce all that electricity in a zero carbon way, and he wants to show that we can do it with 100% renewables. As everyone knows, renewables are variable in their output, typically, except hydro or geothermal. Your basic wind and solar PV and concentrated solar power towers are intermittent, they're variable. So how does he balance load given that? He first shows a lot of load shifting, moving power to power demand to when the power is coming out of the renewables. He also has storage strategies, storage of thermal energy, some production of hydrogen. In this 2050 study, he did not assume batteries, although some of his later work starts to bring in batteries again because they're dropping in cost. And finally, he takes advantage, as all modelers do, of aggregating across geographies the production of wind and solar, which the more you can aggregate with transmission lines, the less variable it becomes. As the sun may be shining here but not there, wind is blowing here, not there. This is all pretty straightforward. Qualitatively, how do you integrate variable renewables? You shift load, you store power, and you broaden geographically the area which you're producing. So let's take a closer look at his numbers. And I'm sorry for the quality of these charts. This is only the second time I'm doing this talk, and I've basically pulled in Jacobson's tables and some figures, and I've tried to annotate them to try to get you to some of the key features. Right now, in this column, we have our sort of current installed capacity across a whole range of renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro. We have about 158 gigawatts installed, including 87 of hydro. Hydro still dominates. And then that's Jacobson's table. I've added up the other sources of power that get us to about 1 terawatt. There's our 1,000 gigawatts when you add in the natural gas, the coal, the nuclear, and some miscellaneous. By 2050, Jacobson is of course dramatically expanding renewables. He gets us to about 1,400 gigawatts of wind, about 3,000 gigawatts of solar, some concentrated solar power towers, much smaller, and some solar thermal just generating heat, not power. That's another piece of his strategy. But it's dominated by variable wind, variable solar, 4,400 gigawatts. You add all those up, and you get to a 6.3 terawatt capacity power system. That is huge. That is, or just to be sure that if we take out the pure solar thermal to store heat, we're a little under 6 terawatts. So multiplying the system almost by a factor of 6, that's a lot less than all of the above scenarios. But that's what our generation mix looks like. Integration, first strategy, as you remember, was flexible load. Jacobs, and again, I'm sorry for the tiny font in his original table, but I'll try to walk you through this. Jacobson makes some very optimistic assumptions on the ability to take our power loads and our thermal loads and move them in time. When we look at residential air conditioning, heating, water heating, etc., he assumes we can move 85% of the total demand around in time through storage or load shifting. Commercial demand, often 95% of demand of load is shifted in time to moving it toward when we have the renewable energy production, or storing it. Transportation is met partly by flexible demand, partly by hydrogen production, electricity use, and finally industry demand moved 50, 95, 85% load shifting in time. That's a very important strategy, but things like this are unprecedented in terms of the small experience we have with demand response and load shifting currently. So that's something to keep in mind. And by the way, he has no cost numbers for what it does to do this. It's implicitly assumed to be done free, and that's also a pretty heroic assumption in my view. Second big integration strategy is storage. This is his chart on how he does storage. Most of the items are pretty small across phase change materials. He's producing some ice, phase change materials that go into concentrated solar power. But the big heavy hitter here is underground thermal energy storage, or UTES, where he has, again, 500, 700, over 1,000 gigawatt equivalent of underground thermal storage. This would require retrofitting underground thermal storage across all sorts of buildings across the U.S., again, at a scale we've never seen before. And he also has some thermal storage that keeps the power towers running in the desert. These are very big numbers, and you can see in one of his footnotes, he's storing 30 days of heating load at the peak winter in some kind of materials, solids, liquids, phase change materials, to get us through winter times when renewable production is way down. Finally, that third integration strategy is transmission, making sure that we can wheel power. I have a graphic here that shows how this is done by very detailed granular modelers who physically model the system, transmission flows, transmission lines that need to be built, etc. In Jacobson, he kind of has a geography-free model. There is no spatial modeling of where plants are built or where transmission lines. He sort of just aggregates the country and assumes that a transmission system will be built that can wheel power very freely around. That's also, and he has a cost number in there, but it's not driven by careful spatial modeling, which again I think is something that we need to take a deeper look at. Let me just stop there for a second on questions before we go to do an even deeper dive on how this might play out in balancing load. Storage, flexible load, transmission, sources, yeah.
The load shifting, can you explain in detail sort of what that means?
Yeah. For industry, it means running plants. Part of the strategy is running plants in the middle of the day when there's solar electricity available. You might not be able to have 3-shift factory plants anymore. You might be able to operate your factories only when we have power available. It means producing hydrogen when the renewables are available and storing it and not producing hydrogen the rest of the time. It means charging electric vehicles only when we have wind and solar available, but running them down when it's not available. So that's, we're taking baby steps in some of these directions, just cycling an air conditioner. You can't run it all the time, run it when the utility lets you run it at a relatively low production cost. But it would be a massive transformation of the power system to have the degree of load shifting as illustrated in some of these figures. I kind of described it, and then his load shifting is shown in some of these graphs. Yeah.
Well, just to build on that for a second, so some part of that equation is possible if there's a will. So if there is a will, we can move our production schedules in certain types of industries to certain times a day, if that's optimal from a climate point of view. But as much as we might think we're powerful, when it's hot, that's when you need the air conditioning. So we're not capable of shifting the time of day when it's hot. So what about that piece in terms of, because
Yeah.
air conditioning was on your sharing of his list. How do you shift that, other than that underground thermal stuff?
Yeah, you have, you're using phase change materials that you can use power to create cold, or you're literally producing ice or storing cold somewhere. And about the only place you want to do it is underground, close to the buildings where you're trying to air condition, and then draw that cold out to meet your air conditioning load. Again, something that we can imagine how to do it, and we are already doing it on a small scale, but whether you can do it kind of at a societal level across almost your whole building fleet, that's daunting. So let me turn to a couple of graphs, and again, these are pulled right out of Jacobson with some annotations by me. The first thing I want to describe is Jacobson runs 6 years, 72 months of simulations on how this can be done, using actual weather data that would drive, like, here's the kind of solar power and the wind power we're going to get, and looks at typical U.S. power loads. And it's very interesting to note that when so we're looking at 72 months here on the x-axis, and we see the green line, solar peaks in the summer because the sun is more direct and you have more hours, of course, and then it bottoms out every winter because angle of sun and shorter days. Wind energy in the blue line tends to peak nationally if we build a ton of windmills more in the spring, and then when you add those two together, you still have an annual cycle of power. He throws in a little bit of light blue solar thermal there too, but you have renewable output peaking in spring and summer, and then bottoming out every fall and winter, with a gap of 600 terawatt hours per month. And again, so this is, you constantly have to contrast this with how we've run a power system for 100 years, which is we build plants and we can run them pretty much flat out and vary the output of some of them to meet the load. And what we have, if we're going to go real heavy on renewables, we have to flip that thinking and say, here's the generation from the sun and wind. How do we conform load to that instead of conforming generation to load? The bottom of this figure shows Jacobson's depiction of the kind of storage and the discharge of storage that would have to match this. When we peak our solar and wind production in the spring, he is peaking his hydrogen production. He's peaking some of his underground thermal storage and other types of storage. And then every winter, he's drawing down thermal storage. He's drawing down hydrogen use. So he has to build systems that can capture this, charge the storage, discharge the storage. And that is part of the challenge here. And I'm finally going to zoom in on some individual days to give you a feel for how this system could be managed in Jacobson's view. I'm going to look at 2 illustrations. Each of these has 4 days of hourly simulations, and then we're going to zoom in, because it's really hard to see what's going on in the graphs, on 2 days of those simulations. And it's going to show what I just said, how load has to follow generation in this brave new world instead of dispatchable power following load. We're going to look for the patterns in wind, solar thermal use, hydro use in the generation side, and on the load side, we're going to see the patterns in what Jacobson views as inflexible load, what he thinks we can do with flexible load, and with hydrogen production and use in thermal storage. And we'll come upon some puzzles. So again, these are lifted out of Jacobson's work, 4 days in November. On the top is total generation, following kind of your typical daily cycle of peaks in the afternoon driven by solar electric in green. We have some wind gently cascading up and down. And this is all sort of stochastic modeling. It's not like this every day, but he runs his model like anyone would, and each day is going to be a little different, but there are patterns, of course. And then on the bottom, we have how he uses flexible load and storage, and I'm going to zoom in because this is so hard to read, but he offers up these sort of 4-day depictions from his stochastic modeling. Now let's see if we can really figure out what's going on. So here's the same graph zooming in on 2 days. And again, typical day, you have a nice hump of solar production, maybe about 10 hours or so. These are half days, so maybe that's almost 12 hours. And then the wind, the blue line goes up and down. You add it all together, and here's your total generation. And now we have to figure out what's going on in the rest of the system that somehow matches the generation we're doing. So on the bottom, in those same hours, first of all, we just have some inflexible load going on here. But Jacobson is saying, I have a bunch of flexible load that can be shifted on the order of 1.5 terawatts. Again, remember, our whole system now is 1 terawatt power. Over here, he's shifting almost 2 terawatts of power to the peak of generation of renewables there. In this down here, he's taking, let's see, I think this is hydrogen production. In those couple of hours, he's running those hydrogen plants, producing hydrogen, but when the sun goes down, now he's below the zero line. He's using hydrogen across these hours. This is November, it's kind of cold. He's discharging thermal storage to warm buildings, I believe, with this light blue line. So you sort of orchestrate various types of storage, various types of load shifting to make sure that you still keep the lights on, that you're balancing supply and demand of electricity every hour of the day. Whether we can shift load like this, 1 terawatt, 2 terawatts, is a big question. The second scenario I'm going to show and then wrap up is 4 days in January. Again, this is lifting out of Jacobson. Again, total generation up here, solar, wind. Now hydro comes into play. Total load down here, flexible loads, inflexible loads, UTES underground storage, charge, discharge, hydrogen production. Now let's zoom in so we can actually see what's going on. Something very puzzling happens on these days and scattering of days through Jacobson's modeling. Here we have our typical solar power in the middle of the day, going up and then down to zero. Here we have a little bit of cascading up and down wind production, a little bit of solar thermal. But whoa, what is happening to the U.S. hydro system? The U.S. hydro system is pulsing up to 1.3 terawatts of power for several hours and then dropping back to zero. Here it's pulsing up to nearly 1 terawatt and dropping back to zero. Jacobson was criticized extremely heavily for this feature among some other features of his modeling. If you may recall, that table I put up at the beginning said the current U.S. hydro capacity is about 87 gigawatts. So by 2050, how do we pulse several hours of 1.3 terawatts of power, more capacity than the entire U.S. capacity of anything right now? And Jacobson, in some comments and responding to questions, said, I came up with a new idea. We go into the existing U.S. hydro system, we keep the existing reservoirs, but we increase the instantaneous capacity by about 15-fold of capacity. And this is a way we can use the U.S. hydro system as sort of a giant peaker to match load. This is probably from an engineering perspective impossible. This is from a downstream flow perspective, water for farms, water for fish. We can't do this. And in some of Jacobson's responses, he says, okay, if we don't do this, we'll do something else. We'll do more concentrated solar power instead of this for the hydro system. So this was a pretty mind-boggling aspect of his modeling. I hope to take the time to dig into some of his 50 state studies and 139 country studies to see where does he go from here with batteries or hydro or thermal storage. But this is how he balanced load in that 2015 study, and he was heavily criticized for it. So I'm going to wrap up. I know it's already 5 o'clock, but say I really heavily commend to you a study by my colleague Jesse Jenkins at MIT and Sam Thernstrom in a DC think tank, who looked across 20-plus studies of decarbonization and teased out some of the insights, some of the modeling approaches across them. And they have a couple of synthesis observations that I think are well worth paying attention to. First, if you build a system that's dominated by variable generation, wind and solar PV, it has to be physically larger, and the total capacity has to be 3 to 4 times peak demand, because you have to move that power around on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to balance all hours and all seasons. What you're going to need to go with it is either a shadow system of dispatchable generation, fossil or otherwise, or very long durational seasonal storage. 2 to 3 months of some combination of electricity and thermal energy to balance everything out and to account for lower fall and winter production, or simply bad weather systems that camp on top of parts of the country for a long time that will decrease wind and solar production. When you build a system that big, you're going to just have a lot of curtailment. The kind of curtailment we're already seeing in California, if you know the phrase duck curve, and you know California has installed a lot of solar, sometimes they just have to spill that solar. There's no use for it unless you have ways to move the power around or store it. You got to build a lot more transmission, and I think we need to do this regardless, but with the more renewables you have, the bigger the transmission system you're going to want to have. And all this comes, of course, at a cost. So let me finally turn to some policy implications. I want to say again that there is no right and wrong here. Who knows exactly what's going to happen between now and 2050 in terms of technology? If batteries become almost free and wind and solar become almost free, maybe we can build a system that works. And the purpose of modeling is not to say who's right and who's wrong. It's to play these what-if scenarios and try to tease out what does that mean for us in the next year? What does that mean for what we should do in the next 5 or 10 years? Not who's right in 2050. I strongly believe, my personal view is that from a perspective of risk management, and if you want to use the portfolio management from finance, we need to spread our chips. It's not prudent to put all of our chips on a 100% renewable scenario at this point of time. It might come true, it might not. We may need our existing nuclear plants. We may need a next generation of nuclear plants, maybe smaller, maybe modular, maybe a different fuel and a different fuel cycle. We need to commercialize carbon capture, even if renewables are really cheap, because we probably need carbon capture for bioenergy plants, which should become a negative emission source in the latter part of this century, or to put on industrial sources for which we have no other options. So all those, to me, all these factors mean to me we need a diversified RD&D portfolio for at least the next 10 years till we see how these things might shake out. I'll stop there. This is a fascinating field, lots of challenges no matter which path we go down, and whether you're an engineer or an economist or a lawyer or a policy analyst, we need sort of all hands on deck of the smartest people to figure our pathways out to 80%, 90%, 100% emissions reductions in the coming 30 years. So I'll take some more questions, and I appreciate everyone's time and interest. Questions? Oh, you again?
I would be interested in your latest thinking in terms of wholesale and retail market design and how that impacts the financeability and build-out ability of the kind of enhanced grid resources that that your study and others showed we need.
Yeah. Do you have another hour? I'll try to be really brief. The question of wholesale market design is already very much in play now, even before we move to this big expansion of the power sector that we'll need to do. It's because even after 20 years of sort of deregulation, restructuring of utilities, we still haven't fully solved the, quote, missing money problem. We are still tinkering with capacity markets, ancillary services markets to complement pure energy KWH markets, just to give incentives to build new capacity. That challenge is now going to be put on steroids if we need to build out fast. And there's different schools of thoughts. One is just do the markets right. Do exactly what the economists told us to do in the 1980s. Personally, I don't think doing more of that better is going to solve the problem. There's another school of thought that says we need to use just a lot more explicit forward contracts, long-term contracts to incentivize higher risk, more capital-intensive plants. We already do that with renewables. They can easily get 15-year contracts in many situations, but we don't let other power sources get that in the renewable markets. So we see a lot of tinkering going on. We see zero emission credits in a place like New York. We see some states saying we need to move away from pure wholesale markets. We need to just let our utilities contract with for the needed capacity. So it's very much in play. And again, we need very smart, innovative people to think through those issues. Yes?
I think one thing I'm curious is from your study, I mean, it focused on utility scale projects and utility scale energy generation, but my thought is distributed energy resources on the retail side, consumer side, will the levelized, what they call the levelized cost of the project or the system, well, it's getting much lower now with storage, even with storage. And it's getting closer to that 7 cents that we see in Philadelphia, at least on consumer side. So, especially now with the federal government, which is gonna like slow down a lot of policy that could help utility scale renewable projects. Well, a lot more people, for example, private industry, they can opt out for the distributed energy resource since it's getting closer to that number. And maybe that can be a factor of a much larger percentage change as an option.
Yeah, my view on that, which will evolve as things change, but my current view is that there's always going to be there's going to be a niche role, maybe even a large niche role, say for rooftop solar, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about distributed generation. There's not really distributed wind. There may be distributed CHP, but if we can't burn fossil fuels directly anymore, CHP may have to be phased out too at the kind of micro level. So we're really talking about rooftop solar. And just the physical fact is you cannot run an economy just with rooftop solar. There's just not enough roofs in our urban areas. So yes, we can produce some of our power, but as we electrify the economy, we're going to have to go outside. We're going to have to rely much more heavily on utility scale solar, maybe in a ratio of 80%, 20%. Again, it may change, the economics may change, but we cannot solve this entire problem just with rooftop solar. I think that's a sort of a physical constraint. Other questions? Yes?
So you mentioned that Jacobson requires for his results that I think 65% of the loads be shifted by time of day, what would your more realistic estimate of how much would actually be possible in terms of load shifting?
Yeah, that table I showed from his study showed, depending on the sector and the end use, there's very interesting ranges, 50, 65, 95, 85% of loads being flexible, either just moving them in time or drawing on thermal storage or other means. I don't have a good answer to your question in terms of what is the maximum we could get. It will vary, certainly by sector, by end use, and we're already seeing that it's already a nascent strategy, but the magnitude that he assumes that we can do by 2050, I think is beyond what certainly my intuition and many others' intuition on what we could do. Yes?
So to piggyback off of that, are those load shifts are they a matter of several hours throughout the day, back and forth, or like months and seasons? And does the amount of either impact the feasibility of load shifting as a viable path forward?
Yeah, it's a mixture. Some load is shifted in Jacobs's model hour to hour to meet to balance supply and demand on the power grid, but other load is shifted, over days or weeks. When you're storing days or weeks worth of heat underground, you're shifting the load off the system from when it would otherwise be demanded. So yeah, it's a strange. It's a mixture of stuff, but when you really get in trouble, it's not hour by hour balancing, but when you have these days, weeks, or even months of storage and load shifting, that's just kind of beyond the pale right now. Yes.
Last question, and it's about the rate at which new renewable energy generation assets are made, and how that will relate to the amount of fossil fuel assets that will have to be given up. So to this day, there's still pipelines being built, plants being built that have long lifespans, so can be 30-year projects, as far as the how the finances works. And then, basically either regulation or policy is going to have to say, well, we're going to give up these sources. And then the question is, on occasions, I've heard of these people asking, well, the ratepayers should pay what we were guaranteed throughout these lifetimes. So, I guess, what's your opinion in that?
Yeah, very difficult questions of what assets are we building now, and which assets might be stranded 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when they have a 30-year life. And I think some thinking along that lines, particularly if you believe we need to switch to 100% renewables as soon as possible, you get the phrase, leave it in the ground, leave everything in the ground now. No more coal infrastructure, no more oil infrastructure, no more natural gas infrastructure, pipelines, ports, what have you. That is a bet you could place, that as a society we should not invest in any of that infrastructure, because it will be outmoded. We will go 100% renewable. And again, I think it's a question of that intelligent people can differ on whether, again, you put all your chips on that scenario, or whether you envision a scenario in which natural gas still plays a key bridge role to the future, because we can capture the carbon using it to generate power. We can capture the carbon if we're burning it in an industrial source. I think it raises interesting questions, such as we're building a lot of natural gas plants right now in addition to renewables. At what point do we say, at a minimum, those natural gas, we should make some investments to make those natural gas plants carbon capture ready? Well, How much should we, what does it mean to be carbon capture ready? How much should we spend on the notion that maybe we would retrofit carbon capture 10 years from now, 15 years from now? I don't have any good answers to those questions, but they're the right questions to ask. All right. Yeah.
Just a quick question. So thank you for doing this, because I'm new to this area, and it's really interesting to see these two approaches contrasted. And I know we're sort of asking you a lot of questions about the one that you've said, you're not in that camp. But I think, if nothing else, it's an interesting exercise to see, how what the implications are of trying to get to 100% renewables. I mean, it's a very interesting exercise. And I'm curious, as a water guy, in this hydro problem that you pointed out. And I'm wondering, was the response, and again, if you don't know, that's fine, but was the response saying, we're taking existing dams and making them bigger, which I understand the critique that you mentioned, or is there a way, working on coasts with tidal, historically we used, a lot of our mills were tidal mills, we used tidal, and micro hydro, and, small scale temporary storage that maybe doesn't ultimately change the flow pattern, it just sort of detains water slowly. Was there any depth to that? And then my second sort of question, and then I'll be quiet, is the non-including batteries, was that due to cost, or I'm guessing not, because you said the cost was not considered, or was it more environmental sort of objection to materials used in batteries and what that would have?
Yeah. On the hydro point, there may be some small increases in hydro capacity, run of the river, micro hydro, this and that, possible, but they just are so small in the big picture of 1 terawatt, 2 terawatt, 3 terawatt systems we might have to expand to, that they just kind of don't show up. Tidal power, wave power is not a near commercial technology, but it has some promise. And maybe I think the physical potential is quite huge, but no one in my mind has in my literature review has put that assumption in, so by 2030, by 2040, by 2050 we have 10% tidal, 30% tidal, or anything like that. But I'm hoping we get some pleasant surprises. I really do, to make all this easier, and that may be one of them. And on the other thing, Jacobson was very explicit in the back and forth with his critics, saying, I am not expanding the total amount of energy produced by our hydro system. The kinetic energy in the reservoirs that will be harvested remains the same. It's just I have this idea of massive increases in instantaneous turbine capacity, and I pulse it when I need it. And like I say, it's I don't think it's possible. On the second question was on batteries. I think the battery price drops have been pretty dramatic just in the last couple of years. And as of modeling considered even the 2015 range, other methods I think were considered cheaper. Jacobson thinks thermal storage can be very cheap. A number of studies runs, instead of storing the electricity in batteries, they literally store it by producing hydrogen. I think that's starting to change, and we are seeing that there are a number of studies that run batteries. The problem with batteries is how you use them and how you develop a cost number like cents per kilowatt hour can be very, very tricky. If you use a battery only a tiny percentage of the time to balance a little bit of load, the cents per kilowatt hour is huge. If you're using batteries all the time, if you're cycling them a huge amount of time, then the cost looks much lower. It's an area that I'm not an expert in, but again, I know it's promising that battery prices are falling, but the experts I've talked to on batteries say this, it's not yet a panacea that makes this easy. One last question.
Another question. I wonder how Jacobson might have tacitly assumed that all this was going to be successful enough to halt climate change in its tracks so that the hydrologic regimen of our biggest reservoirs, which are in the west, at a time when snowpack is diminishing rapidly, when rainfall is diminishing rapidly, and so the existing hydro out west is never going to come close to what it's doing now.
It's a very scary question
mean,
you're raising, because
I wonder what
we
we
have-
were smoking.
we have climate change baked into the system, and it could dramatically affect the annual output of our hydro system 10, 20, 30 years from now. It's even possible, what if weather patterns change? And is our wind speeds gonna remain the same in this part of the country, that part of the country, or even the amount of cloud cover and solar? I've never seen anyone do anything but pose that question. I haven't seen any modeling of what if, but it's kind of scary. Yeah.
But actually, that was an interesting point you brought up, because if we've lost the, snowpacks, but dams could temporally distribute the flow of rivers the way they would be if there were snowpack, right? So in other words, now you got rain, you got more, and not all the projections say that there's a reduction in rain, there could be an increase in rain. So if you're increasing the rain and it's coming as rain and not snow, and you store it and then you generate energy as you distribute it slowly, it's kind of interesting, actually, that I don't know how, anywhere near the scale of what we're talking about. But
It's just too many variables.
Yeah.
I mean, he would have been, well,
Yeah.
you could
But
buy the rest of it, but the hydro,
Yeah. I want to close on an optimistic note, which is we haven't really talked about cost. I've been trying to talk about technology and load balancing and pathways that just kind of keep the lights on. The studies that take sort of the all the above approach across a variety of models indicate that we can get to 80% at a cost of maybe 1 or 1.5% of GDP. It's not free, but it's not like we need to take 10 or 20 or 50% of GDP to solve this problem. Most economists who do the numbers honestly think that if we do this smart, we can keep the cost at a very manageable level. So that makes me optimistic, and also I think technology is going to bring us some pleasant surprises. So let's get on with the job. Thanks again.
Thank you.
of course, that 1 to 1.5% of GDP is what they've just given away in the tax rate.
Oh, don't get me started.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
You know, I've regretted not having any ground truth on my